our first speaker. I think Nelson Mandela said, sport has the power to change the world. I've had the privilege of spending a few days with Rob, and his list of achievements include an Olympic gold in the single sculls, sailing in the America's Cup, playing rugby for Waikato, building a successful investment business, and leading the Olympic team in his current role as chef de mission, all while remaining a humble family man. Rob, you're someone that is remaining relevant in sport, and I think that's really important. You've raised the fern on the world stage and in the minds of many New Zealanders, so welcome to the stage. Yeah, so how do you keep or how does your leadership style keep the team in the right psychological space when they're under so much pressure building into the Olympic Games?
Yeah, it is a high pressure environment. You are at the coalface of elite sport, and ultimately these things are, unfortunately, in some ways, measured by outcomes. So we work really closely with the athletes and the teams to make sure that we do everything we can leading up to the event. I guess for me it's a very clear leadership role that I've been given, and I think the things that have helped me in that space have been having a clear vision about where I'd like the team to go, having the credibility to be able to be at the front of the team. I guess as an athlete, I've been through all the different experiences. I've been fortunate enough to win. I've been a young up-and-comer, and I also haven't had the success that I would have liked. I won't term it that I was a loser, but I've had a really wide range of experience, so that helps as well. I think humility is always a good thing in leadership, and I think probably one of the biggest privileges I have in the team is you have so many capable people in our leadership group, and the privilege of being able to pull all those ideas together and become a lot more than what you might have achieved individually. So we operate across a range of areas. We do all the planning with the sports. People often ask, what is it that you actually do? So we do a lot of planning. No surprise to many of you in the room that the sports that perform the best at these pinnacle events are also the ones that are the best prepared. It sounds kind of logical, but how do we know this? We know it because we're at the coalface of their planning, and you can see sports that are down to the tiniest little detail to those that are coming in the week of the Commonwealth Games are going, oh no, I'm overweight by 8 kilograms for my weight class and I've got to suddenly crash diet. Those are some of the extremes of what you see. We do all of the logistics, the balls, the bikes, the accreditation, the entry, the uniform. We also do handle all the media. In this day and age, you'd appreciate what an incredibly dynamic environment that is. There used to be just 1 or 2 portals. Now there's 400 reporters in our team that have all got their own channels. But the final piece I'll talk about, and I think where it's relevant today, is we try and create a really positive team culture through leadership. We have an interesting dynamic, and it might be like many of your teams where you've got a wide group of people and personalities actually spread right throughout the country, and in some parts right throughout the world. I've got a lot of young athletes at scholarships in the States, and we're only together for a really short period of time. We're only together for 2 weeks, and somehow in that short frame, we've got to become a team. We've got to come aligned. We've got to make sure we're on the same page. So we work really, really hard on our team culture, using our channels, and making sure that we create a performance environment so that people can get the very best out of themselves.
So I've noticed over the last 2 times we've chatted, you're really self-actualized, and that's obviously come through your family upbringing. There's a lot of parents in the room. Can you tell us a little bit about the role they played?
Sure can. So I feel very proud of where I was brought up. I was brought up on a farm in the King Country in a place called Putepu. Does anyone know where Putepu is? I know one guy does. It's my brother over there, so he should know. But really proud of who we were as a family and how we were brought up, as you'd expect in a remote-ish place like Putepu. You've got space, you've got freedom, you've got room to think. And I learnt a lot of key values at a young age that I really believe helped me and still help me to this very day. I guess one of them was work ethic. That sits at the very heart of any success that I've seen in sport has been work ethic. And I spent many years, and once I left school and between university, dagging sheep, if anyone knows what dagging sheep is. And my father always told me that dagging sheep would help my rowing career to make me fit. I think it did, I'm not sure, but he might have been angling for the free labour. But anyway, those sort of things, funnily enough, they give you a real sense of pride in who you are as a person. And I think it's something as New Zealanders we can all take with us wherever we are in the world. We come from this great place. We feel, we're very high on the global integrity stakes. We do some wonderful things. We're not big politically or economically, but we do some incredible things for the size of nation that we are. And so those are the sort of values I think that you carry forward and help you later in life.
Awesome. And our kids are growing up in this unprecedented time of change. So the Olympic movement's been around in New Zealand. 1894 was founded, and there's spectators flocking to esports and online gaming. How does the Olympic movement remain relevant in that space?
So it is a changing space, and that's one thing that's certain, right? Has changed. It's always coming, and I guess that's why we have to remain relevant. And sport asks itself that same question all the time. So esports is one example, and I'm still struggling to link the term E and sports together, actually, to be honest. But it's coming, and it's there, and it's now part of the Asian Games. It's possibly going to be a demonstration sport at Paris 2024. But an example, I think, of how the IOC is trying to remain relevant is it has brought new sports in that have higher participation globally. So these are sports such as surfing, speed climbing, skateboarding, baseball, softball. They are sports that have all had big growth. So the IOC's recognised that. I think closer to home, there's some pockets of what I might call brilliance happening within New Zealand sport, because very fortunately, most sports in New Zealand are supported by the government, and there's gaming and community that sit around that as well. So when our athletes go away, inevitably the nation is interested in their success, and we win some gold medals. But the big question comes up: so what? What does that mean? Because our athletes have done well, what's the relevance of that? And I think that's something that's hard to link between. Does that mean more people participate? Does that mean more healthier community outcomes? No one's ever been able to actually prove that, interestingly enough, despite all of the Olympic Games that have happened around the world. At the same time, no one's been able to disprove it. I think where sport has to evolve to and become more relevant is that so what question. So some examples I can give of that are, I guess, close to things I've been working on within the New Zealand Olympic Committee. So we now have an education program that goes through most schools throughout New Zealand. That's been seen as one of the leading programs in that space. And when the Olympic Games come along, the Commonwealth Games come along, inevitably there's a resource that's relevant. It aligns to the curriculum. It talks about what sport does. It talks about the values of sport, and kids can connect to that. As part of that Olympic program, the schools also get a free speaker, which is a great incentive. Schools enjoy having some of these athletes come along and talk as well. So that's one example I can talk about. The Olympic Committee's also led the way with women in sport as well, and there's some really good initiatives there. I could talk about those for another 10 minutes. One of the more interesting ones, however, has been, I run a sports marketing business, and in that space, one of my clients is Touch New Zealand. So Touch New Zealand has brought in a community program to target crime and try and improve that aspect in some of the areas that we have. So Glen Innes was a trial space that happened 2.5 years ago, where we partnered with the New Zealand Police, the Ministry of Social Development, and local council, and hosted free touch tournaments on a Friday evening. There was a meal afterwards, and all the families and community came along. And it was done on a Friday night because that's when historically most of the crime statistics were at their worst. The results for that were just incredible. So tagging statistics for that period of time, over that 2 to 3 month period, dropped from 600 reported incidents down to 1. It reduced the sort of them and us aspect of what was going on between police and people that might have been offending. And I think it just provides a really good example about how sport can be relevant and how it can be bigger than sport itself.
Awesome, man. Can you talk to the Olympic values a wee bit and how you personify those?
Sure. So the key values of the IOC are friendship, respect and excellence, and I guess they're really important words when we talk about our team and how we come together as a group. Respect is probably something that most athletes just get straight away. We have a team culture with 5 key values, 5 key pillars, like pride, respect, excellence, integrity and leadership. And respect sits at the top of that. We can be very prescriptive with our athletes, and we can tell them, here's your agreement. You said that thou shall not do this, thou shall abide by the rules. Athletes aren't interested in that. And in fact, I don't know how much depth they actually go to when they come into the team and understanding it. But they care greatly for their teammates. So there might be something they're about to put on social media, there might be post-competition behaviour, all those different aspects of a big team. We encourage our athletes to think about those values, always think about respecting their teammates, and that's really meaningful. They don't care for the bit of paper, but they care a lot for the athlete that's sleeping next door and that they might wake up and they might affect their performance. Pride is another key value for us within the Olympic Committee. We want our athletes to feel like they've got an edge over their opposition. And I think the interesting thing about my role is I've gone from being an athlete to being an administrator, and I'm a tiny, tiny part of that end result, less than 1%. But we want our 1% to be an advantage. We want it to provide that leading edge, because that might be all that separates success and failure at that highest level. So pride is another key thing. Integrity, our athletes and our team are really proud of who we are as a nation. So that's important, and we message that to our team all the time. Leadership is the fourth value I'll talk about. I think it's relevant in sport because you always have to ask yourself two things. The first thing is, what might happen next? What might my opposition do? What might change in my area? And the second thing you always have to ask yourself is, well, what will I do about it? As a general rule in sport, if you're looking at your opposition and thinking, gee, that's a good idea, I wish we'd thought of that, or if someone's telling you to do your job, you're actually following. And following in sport means coming second, and often that means that you don't survive, especially in events like the America's Cup. So that's another key value. And then the final one is excellence. We are what we do repeatedly. Nowhere do you see that more than in the world of sport, where athletes will repeat the same movement, the same technique, the same thought processes over and over again coming into a pinnacle event. And the logic being that if you make excellence a habit, that largely predetermines your outcome. So those are the sort of core values that we work on within our team, and we promote and share that culture throughout all the different sports.
In Christchurch, you talked to the process outcome, and you alluded a little bit to it there around excellence. Can you talk to that a wee bit?
So it's always a topical thing in sport, is the outcome and the process. And it's one of the easiest traps to get caught up in life. No matter where we are, things tend to have outcomes wrapped around them. And in sport, our funding is dependent on how many medals we win. So it's often hard for athletes to sort of separate themselves from that. But it's one of the most basic underlying principles, I believe, that make our athletes that are successful achieve to where they have, is focusing on the process, taking care of that day after day after day, whatever that might be, and making it really high quality. And we are what we do repeatedly. Ultimately, that becomes a habit, and that's what you produce when it counts. People often say, success at that level, you must have to be tough. I believe it's a lot more about being clever. It's about forcing your mind to think the right things under pressure. And if that's what you do every day, that's what happens when it really counts.
Cool. So, I mean, that's some pretty deep stuff, right? But important to business and sport, and you've managed to transition across to business now as well. Can you talk to that transition? How have you done that?
Yeah, I've found it almost a personal challenge, and something that's really interesting. In my time in sport, you do ask yourself, well, how will these skills transfer? Will they actually help me when I come out and get into the real world? I think in some ways sport's quite easy, and I've got a massive respect for those that have achieved in business, because sport's so defined. You know exactly what day you're going to compete, you know what time you have to line up, and generally you know what you have to do to be successful. And I've found in my time when I've come out, there's so many different ways. There's 50 different choices in front of you, and only one of them might be the right one. So I have found it quite a journey transferring the things that help me in sport into a business sense, into administration, and the things that I do now. I've almost had to relearn them. And I've looked across and I thought, what are those key themes and how do they relate? And I think there are some similarities. And I guess there's a word that represents success well in sport, and that word is wealth. Now, the first thing you might think of is financial success. It's an obvious conclusion. But your wealth can be measured in lots of different ways. There's the wealth of the relationships you've got in your life with your husband, your wife, your family, your friends. There's the wealth of your own health and well-being. How fit and well are you? There's the wealth of your own career and how much you enjoy what you do. But ironically for me, I've actually found it's an acronym. It forms an acronym for the things I believe create that success in sport, business, and relationships. So I'll just take you through it briefly. W stands for work ethic. Work ethic's the absolute backbone of any success that I've witnessed or been a part of. It's not 99%, it's 100%, leaving no stone unturned. I'm going to be accused of bias here, but I'll refer to the New Zealand rowing team, who consistently are one of the best performing nations in the world. And I can tell you from seeing them train, especially recently, their work ethic is incredibly high. Now, work ethic can mean lots of different things to different sectors. For example, in sport, work ethic for a rower is very different to work ethic for a sprinter. They train differently, they've got different energy systems, but it stands for commitment, focus, dedication, quality. You know what work ethic is in your chosen field. The second word in the wealth acronym is excellence. We are what we do repeatedly. Again, you see that repeated time and time again in sport. So the logic is that you make excellence a habit, and that goes a long way to helping you achieve that final outcome. A stands for attitude. As athletes, you spend hours training your bodies to react a certain way, and they become fitter and stronger and faster. I'm going to suggest that mind is equally as relevant. So whether you think you can achieve something or not, you're probably right, because your mind responds the same way. Whatever you put in there day after day becomes a habit. L is for leadership. Just referring to my point before that in sport you always have to anticipate. You have to ask yourself those two things: what's around the corner? What will I do about it? But the important point I'll add to that is that's up to everyone in a team to take initiative. You know, I'd highlight that the America's Cup that was won recently by Team New Zealand, the innovation and the initiative that gave them one of their biggest competitive advantages came from the crew and the team. It didn't come from the amazing designers, it didn't come from the head of the team, it came from people taking leadership in their chosen areas. So that's a really interesting reflection on that. T stands for teamwork. It's something that was new to me after I spent years being a single sculler. I have learnt that crew reunions and the single scull are quite lonely things. So suddenly I was with a whole lot of friends. But I did have quite a competitive focus, and I used to think, why should I share any information with people who I'm also trying to beat? Because Team New Zealand's a very competitive environment, and it may reflect how many of your organisations are run, where everyone's got different career paths, you're all trying to grow, you're all trying to improve. And I guess for me, as we got closer to that pinnacle event, I realised it's almost irrelevant what I'm trying to achieve. The only thing that matters is how the team goes. So by trying to be an amazing team player, by giving, by sharing, by helping those around me, I was also trying to beat. Ironically, that was the best way of achieving my goals and my agenda was by being an amazing team player. And the final word I'll talk about is happiness. That's H in the wealth acronym. Are you happy with what you're doing in life? Do you enjoy what you do? Have you found what you're truly passionate about? No doubt many of you have seen the Simon Sinek clip on YouTube, why we do what we do. Well, that's what that's about. And I guess I've been fortunate to do things that I'm really passionate about and that I've been able to enjoy over a long period of time. So that's a bit of a high level view of the things that I believe create success between sport and business and relationships. And hopefully if you take one thing away from that, it's been worthwhile.
Thanks, Rob. We'll pass it over to the floor for questions shortly, but there's been some sentiment around toxic culture in sport recently, in the media. Would you mind talking to that?
Yeah, so sport in New Zealand, because of its large government investment and the fact that many of our athletes and teams are quite high profile, does attract a lot of focus. And I guess the funding model for most of our Olympic sports is performance-based, and there tends to be a bit of a mentality of everything's all right here, just move along, we're all just fine. You don't need to look too closely, and possibly that's an area of risk through many of our sports. I think there's two quite topical issues at the moment. The first one is athlete voice. There has been a lot of attention on that and the way that our athletes are treated. I think potentially there are pockets of sport which have been quite hard with coaches, maybe in the way they communicate. But equally, I also am currently concerned about that pendulum swinging too far to the left. And we have had great success as a sporting nation because of our core Kiwi culture. We just get on with the job. We do what we need to do. We make things happen. We've got a can-do attitude rather than a what's in it for me attitude. And so I think that's really important going forward, that we recognise that and we make sure we get a balance. I was recently an athlete, so I'm hugely in favour of athlete voice and athletes being well supported, but there's also a reality that when you line up on the start line, you need to know you've done more than your opposition, that you're better prepared than they are, because it is a very cutthroat world when you line up in an Olympic final. The second piece I'll talk about there, Jed, is just the focus that most of our sports are funded by their outcomes, and that can lead to some of the channels and communication around that being quite outcome focused, obviously. So that's something we work on all the time with our athletes at the games and in the build up to, is work on the things that you can control and the things that matter. There's from my own personal experience, I can tell you one of the most daunting crossroads I've faced in my life was that half hour before the Olympic final in Sydney. The reality is at that level, it's one thing. First is one direction, second is a very different direction. And I think there's a perception that athletes have got some way of dealing with the tension and the nerves that go with it, but I can promise you, you're every bit as anxious and nervous as those around you. So the things that helped me were focusing on what mattered, and that was making a boat go fast. Nothing else mattered. There's all this distraction, there's all this hype, but essentially it's what we do every day that achieves that outcome is really important. And I think that's, again, probably a reminder for all of us in sport about the things we need to talk about, the things we need to communicate. And just briefly, Jed, I'll touch on one of your earlier points about the role that we play as parents. Many of us are parents in the room, and I've got 3 young kids, 10, 13 and 15, and they're at an interesting age where they're all playing sport. People ask 2 questions. One, are they tall? The kids are tall. But secondly, do they all row? No, they don't row. And they do a wide variety of sports. We're really keen to see them have fun, develop a wide range of skills, be happy, healthy people, and we can control it hugely by the messaging we give them. So whether it's at high performance or whether it's your 10-year-old kid, what we say and how we communicate that has a massive impact on the happiness and the direction of those young people. So for example, Maddie, my 10-year-old daughter, played football last year, lost every single game in the season. She had so much fun. She had such a good time. And every time we talked to her about it was, did you have fun? Or that was a wonderful kick you did from the sideline, or that was great sportsmanship you showed to that young person. That's what excites them. That's what motivates them at that age. They really enjoy being part of a team. They enjoy being with their friends. So those are some of the things that we try and bring into our culture as well when we're at the highest level. It's the same basic principles. So athletes love being there. They feel very proud to represent New Zealand, and by focusing on that process, focus on making a boat go fast, that's ultimately what helps achieve those outcomes.
Cool. I don't think it's just at that age, but we'll pass it over to the floor now for questions. Does anyone want to ask Rob a question? We don't get a chance every day to talk to Olympic champion.
Hey Rod, how you doing?
Hi.
I'll just talk loud.
Good, okay.
Just wondering what evolution you've seen in terms of the role of the coach. So for us in an organisation, it's the role of the leader or manager. How have you seen that develop over time? You can see a change in the All Blacks, for instance, about how Steve Hansen manages the team, much more self-organisation.
Do you want to just relay the question?
Sure, so the question there is, how have we seen the evolution of coaching and management in the sporting circles, recognising that applies to a lot of people in the room and the different roles you've got with the teams around you. So great question, and I think high performance sport continues to evolve, it continues to grow, and when you compete overseas, you realise that the benchmark just keeps lifting all the time. So with our teams and what we put around people, it's important to have the right learning, the right structures, the right education. I think some recent things I've seen in New Zealand sport has been a real education around a lot of our coaches. A lot of the core values we try and communicate that I was talking about around the process and around how you can communicate with people, how you can drive a positive team culture are happening well within New Zealand because we're very collaborative, so we work well together. That's actually, instead of all, in New Zealand you've got different entities, you've got the sports themselves, you've got the government funding agency, High Performance Sport New Zealand, and then you've got the Olympic Committee. And one thing we're doing is we're working together really well collaboratively. So that's the first point I'll make, just to your question, is education has been really important to the coaches themselves, then how they spread that throughout their teams. So that continues to be an important space. I think the breadth of what they're doing now has grown. Ironically, they do have wider teams around them, but sports psychology and mental readiness is a really big factor for many of our athletes and teams now. I'd reflect on Rio, and I'd say a lot of our athletes, even some of our more seasoned athletes, potentially didn't quite get that right. And so we are finding now that education with coaches, helping them help their athletes, has become really important, helping them be aware of it. They may not be the clinical psychologist, they might not be the expert, but they might have enough awareness and education to be able to cope and deal with that as well, and to be able to pass that on to the right people. So those are some of the examples I can give. But coaching, we do have some great people in our team. We've got coaches, we've got managers, we've got the sports psych that goes with it too. And I think the big thing is we try and be thorough. We try and make sure that there's no stone unturned, and that there's no gaps there for the athletes.
Anyone else?
Hi, Rob. Apparently the saying is when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Can you think of an example of a time when you've had a good team spirit, obviously a great culture, and some sort of adversity has happened and it's started to impact on the culture and the performance of a team?
Absolutely. A couple of good examples that come to mind. I'll talk about my time with the Emirates Team New Zealand. Some of you may remember the America's Cup in San Francisco in 2013, where, I hate to bring it up, but where you were on the receiving end of a pretty dramatic loss there. And people often ask the question, how did you keep getting out there and doing it every day? Did you genuinely believe you still had a chance? And I can promise you, right up into that final race, every person in that team still believed that we were capable of winning that. And I'm sure there's some really great models out there about how to pick yourself up off the floor. There's some nice books that have been written. But on my reflection, it's quite a simple three-stage process. The first thing is you get to the very bottom of what went wrong. So every day we would come in, and I've seen this right throughout sport, you get to the core of what the problem is. Now, that's actually quite a hard thing to do in America's Cup campaigns. America's Cup's famous for what they call the America's Cup handshake. Race is lost, team comes in, boss says what went wrong, and the handshake goes something like this. It was his fault. So no one wants to admit to it. But that's the hardest thing, is drilling down, down, down till you get to the very bottom of what that core problem was. The second thing that happens is, I believe, solutions become very apparent. And when solutions become apparent, the third piece is that you get a whole new sense of belief, which is what was happening in that series. So quite a simple way of looking at it. But to give you an indication, we started that America's Cup doing 18 knots of boat speed upwind. We finished doing 33. Fortunately, there was a boat that was 1 knot faster than us. But that gives you an idea of how, in the face of adversity, we maintained belief in ourselves. We got to the bottom of the problems, we found solutions, and we kept improving. The second example I'll give would be the Rio Olympic Games in 2016, which was really disorganised. We turned up, we had 75 apartments. A lot of them had ceilings which were collapsing. We had live electrical wires everywhere, gas leaks, bad combination. Some of the apartments were flooded, water up to your ankles. And within a week, we had 400 people coming in for the pinnacle event of their life, the Olympic Games. So we were in a really difficult situation, to the point where even none of the fire systems were working in the building. So from a health and safety point of view, what do you do there? We had also this fascinating situation in Rio where the country was on the verge of bankruptcy. So what these tradespeople were doing is they were finishing their jobs and then going around and sabotaging them so that they create more work. We actually had to follow some of those groups around to ensure that the jobs were simply getting done. So here we were, all these things going wrong, and in the heat of battle, there's sort of three things that came to mind: people, process, and planning. And we had excellent people in our team, and when we sat down and we talked, we were able to make good decisions. So people was a really good, I guess, benchmark to start from. The second thing was planning. We were the first team in to the village. We were the first to find the problems. We were the first to solve many of them. We were the first to be at the front of the queue to find answers. And as a result, we didn't have any problems during the games because the other teams didn't plan as early and get things done as well, and those problems lingered right throughout the games. And the final piece is process. I guess I'm a firm believer that when you're under pressure, you want to search for that neutral frame of mind. Has this happened or not is neither good nor bad. It's unemotional. It's just part of a process. And when you have those processes in place, and we have many of them around health and safety, around management of critical incidents, around how we handle our media, if you're well planned, you can work through many of those processes just with, did this happen, yes or no, how will we deal with it, we'll do this or this. And those were some of the ways I'd reflect that we cope with what was a very difficult situation. I guess the ultimate compliment for us is we got right through the games period without a single complaint or problem from the athletes that affected their performance. So that's just some thought that may relate to what you do within your organisations.
So our time's up there, guys. We'll take one more question from the
Just
floor.
one more question. Rob, as an administrator, how do you encourage minor sports? You mentioned high performance New Zealand funds, those sports that do well because it's all outcome focused. So how do you stay in touch to encourage the minor sports that may drop out from the elite sphere to have those participants do their best to get back to the top of their sports and eventually represent New Zealand at that Olympic level?
So we do have a wide representation of success at the Olympic Games. No secret, it's public knowledge that we have a targeted funding campaign, so the government does target and fund certain sports. At the Rio Olympic Games, we got 18 medals. It was our most successful Olympic Games ever from 9 different sports, which is a very wide reach. Per head of population, we are consistently one of the best nations in the world. I think we're beaten by Jamaica, who got a couple of golds, have a smaller population, but one sport. So diversity across our sporting codes is something that we are pleased with, recognising that there's 60 different sports in New Zealand. The pie's only so big, they can only be funded so many ways. We also had 11 of the medals came from females or female teams within the team too. So there is some good reach and some good breadth happening, but inevitably a lot of our sports do run on the smell of an oily rag. The way that it works generally in New Zealand, and whether it's the best way or not, is that if an athlete does show promise, for example, a young athlete like Dylan Schmidt in trampolining, they're recognised in early age and they are supported and they are given funding. And then what happens is that enables other opportunity within that organisation. So I can point to canoe kayak at the moment, which we all know. Lisa Carrington, household name in New Zealand. Canoe kayak now is seen as one of our targeted sports. Only 2 Olympics ago it had pretty much been forgotten about. It barely had enough funding to support a CEO. So I guess rightly or wrongly that's the way that it has worked within New Zealand sport. And I've noticed many of our organisations, the remaining sports that aren't funded have had to be very innovative. Like sport like Touch New Zealand has had to look at ways to remain relevant and look at ways that they can survive and grow and really engage with the communities around them.
Cool. Thanks so much for being here today, Rob. Awesome to see culture and leadership personified in the way that you communicated it. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jed. Thanks for having me.